60 meters per second. That is the gust the people of Japan's Sakishima Islands are being told to prepare for tonight. A wind strong enough to destroy a roof and throw a vehicle. It is coming from Typhoon Bavi, the strongest storm on Earth this year, a system that flattened a United States island as a Category 5 only days ago and is now hours from Japanese soil. The airports are closed, the ferries are cancelled, the islands are alone, and whether they face a hard night or a catastrophic one comes down to a race no one can see between the storm and the sea. One thing before we get into it. If you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next Nightwatch, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's break this down. Part 1. The Turn. Somewhere over the warm sea east of the northern Philippines tonight, the most powerful storm on Earth this year has just changed its mind about where it's going. For a week, Typhoon Bavi marched west across the open Pacific like something with a single-minded purpose, and for a week the question was always about somewhere else. First it was a set of small American islands, then it was the open water beyond them. Now the question has narrowed to a single uncomfortable answer, and that answer is Japan. Bavi has turned, and it is headed straight for the southern islands of a nation that has spent the last 2 days quietly bracing for impact. If you have never heard the name Bavi before tonight, here is the short version of what you need to understand. This is not a storm that is forming. This is not a storm that might become dangerous if conditions line up. This is a storm that has already flattened one inhabited island, already earned its place among the strongest cyclones the planet has produced in years, and is now closing the distance to the next set of islands in its path at about 20 kilometers per hour. Everything frightening about this storm is already proven. The only thing left to decide is exactly how hard it lands on Japan and how many hours the people there have left to get ready. Trace the arc of this storm's life, and you begin to understand why its turn toward Japan carries such weight. Bavi began as a modest, disorganized system far out over the open Pacific, the kind of storm that could have gone in any direction or fizzled entirely. Instead, it found the warm water and it grew, and it kept growing, escalating through the categories with the kind of relentless intensification that the Western Pacific specializes in, until it stood as a maximum-strength super typhoon. It took aim at the Northern Mariana Islands and struck them at the height of its power. Then it pressed onto the west, holding its strength across an enormous span of ocean, and began the long curve that has now brought it around toward the southern islands of Japan. Every stage of that journey was a step toward tonight. That history is exactly why the current threat should not be underestimated. This is not a storm that stumbled into significance. It is a storm that has been demonstrating its power for a week, that reached the top of the scale and stayed dangerous far longer than most storms manage. When a system like that turns toward a populated coastline, its track record comes with it. The Sakishima Islands are not being threatened by an unknown quantity. They are being threatened by a proven, powerful, well-documented monster whose capabilities have already been written across the islands it passed. And that is what makes the next 24 hours so tense, because everyone can see exactly what is coming. As of this evening, Bavi sits over the ocean east of the northern Philippines, grinding toward the west-northwest, and the number that tells you the most about it is its central pressure. That pressure is sitting near 930 hectopascals. If that figure means nothing to you yet, hold on to it, because by the end of tonight you will understand exactly why a number below 950 is the kind of thing that makes meteorologists sit up straighter in their chairs. A storm's central pressure is the single cleanest measure of how much raw energy it is carrying, and Bavi is carrying an enormous amount. Its sustained winds are running near 180 kilometers per hour, and all of that power is now pointed at Japan's Sakishima Islands, with the clock already running. Japan is not treating this as a distant possibility. The country's weather agency is tracking this system as Typhoon number 9, and it has already told the people of the southern islands what is coming and roughly when. The forecast calls for Bavi to make its closest approach to the Sakishima Islands from the night of July 10th into the early hours of July 11th. That is the window. That is when this storm, which has crossed an entire ocean to get here, finally arrives at Japanese soil, and the numbers attached to that arrival are not gentle. We're going to walk through every one of them, because the story of the next 24 hours is written in those numbers. You might be wondering why a storm that started its life near American territory in the middle of the Pacific has ended up threatening the southern edge of Japan. The answer is that Bavi has been on a long curving journey, and Japan happens to sit at the end of the curve. To understand why tonight matters, you have to understand that this is not a new storm arriving out of nowhere. This is the same storm that has been building and travelling and destroying for a week, and Japan is simply the next name on a list it has been working through. What makes tonight different from every night before, it is that this is the first time the storm has been aimed at a place where more than 1 million people live within reach of its wind. The islands in the crosshairs are the Sakishima group, which sits at the far southwestern end of the long chain of Japanese islands that trails off toward Taiwan. This is Okinawa Prefecture, but it is the part of Okinawa most people never picture. It is Ishigaki. It is the Yaeyama Islands. It is a scattering of communities perched on the edge of the East China Sea, closer to Taipei than to Tokyo, and they are about to take the direct force of a storm that measures its winds in a way that turns the air itself into a weapon. Over the next several minutes, I am going to show you exactly what Bavi has already done, exactly what it is forecast to do to Japan, and the one enormous question that nobody, not the forecasters, not the modelers, not the people boarding up their windows tonight, can yet answer. Let me give you a sense of the scale of what is approaching, because the phrase most powerful storm on Earth this year is not a throwaway line. It is a specific claim, and Bavi has earned it. Over the course of 2026, the planet has produced a long roster of tropical cyclones across every ocean basin, and Bavi stands at the top of that list. It reached the most extreme classification a storm can hold, and it did so over one of the most energy-laden stretches of ocean anywhere on Earth. When a storm becomes the strongest of an entire year, it means that out of every system that spun up across the whole planet over 12 months, this is the one that pushed closest to the physical limit of what the atmosphere and ocean can build. And that is the storm now curving toward the southern islands of Japan. There is a temptation, when a storm has been in the news for a week, to feel like you have already heard this story, like Bavi is old news, a system you have been watching on the map for so long that its arrival somewhere new feels routine. I want to push against that feeling hard, because it is exactly the kind of fatigue that gets people hurt. Every previous chapter of Bavi's life happened somewhere else, to someone else, over water or over islands far from Japan. Tonight is the first time this storm has been aimed squarely at a place where more than 1 million people live across Okinawa Prefecture, at communities with names and histories and families boarding up their homes. The storm may be familiar. The threat to these specific islands is brand new, and it is arriving fast. Because here is the strange part, the part that makes this storm so much more unsettling than a simple headline can capture. Bavi is technically weakening, and I need you to understand why that word, weakening, might be the most dangerous word in this entire forecast. Part 2. What Japan is being told. The forecast Japan has issued for Bavi reads less like a weather bulletin and more like a countdown. It moves through the hours the way a fuse burns towards something, and each stage of it is worse than the one before. This is the official picture the country's weather agency has painted for the people of the Sakishima Islands, and I want to take you through it hour by hour, because the escalation itself tells you everything about what this storm is going to be when it arrives. By the morning of July 10th, the forecast calls for average wind speeds of at least 15 meters per second to be reaching from the Sakishima Islands up through Okinawa's main island region and out to the Daito Islands. 15 meters per second is already a serious wind. That is more than 50 kilometers an hour of steady, sustained force, strong enough to make walking difficult and to start bringing down small branches and loose debris. And that is just the leading edge. That is the storm announcing itself, still hours away from its closest approach. If you were standing on Ishigaki on the morning of July 10th, that wind would be the first physical sign that the thing you'd been watching on the map for days had finally reached out and touched you. From there, the numbers climb. Through the daytime of July 10th, the winds are forecast to strengthen, and the agency warns that gusts of 30 meters per second or more become possible. A gust of 30 meters per second is a different category of danger entirely. That is over 100 kilometers an hour in a sudden punch of air, the kind of gust that peels roofing, topples poorly secured structures, and turns anything not tied down into a projectile. And remember, this is still the build-up. This is Bavi clearing its throat. The main event has not arrived yet. That is the pattern I need you to hold on to as we go, because the whole shape of this storm's approach is a staircase, and every step up is a step toward the moment of closest approach. Before that peak arrives, though, there is a stretch of hours where the storm is clearly serious but not yet at its worst, and that stretch is its own kind of test. It is during the build-up that the final decisions get made, that the last people come in off the roads, that the shelters fill and the doors close. The build-up is when a community either finishes its preparation or discovers too late what it missed. And because Bavi's approach is so compressed, with closest approach only a day or so out from the current advisories, that build-up window is short. There is not a comfortable margin of days in which to reconsider and adjust. The staircase of rising winds is climbing quickly, and every step up narrows the time remaining to get ready. That compression is part of what makes Bavi's approach to Japan so tense. A storm that gives a week of warning allows for a measured, unhurried preparation. A storm whose most dangerous hours are barely a day away forces everything to happen at once, in a rush, against a closing window. The Sakishima Islands have used their advance notice well, starting 3 days out, precisely because they understood that once the wind began to climb the staircase in earnest, the time for preparation would evaporate. Now they are in the final stretch of that window, watching the numbers rise toward the peak, knowing that the hardest hours are nearly upon them. That moment comes late on July 10th and into the early hours of July 11th. This is the peak of the threat, the hours the entire forecast has been building toward, and the numbers here are genuinely frightening. Around the time of closest approach, average winds in some areas are forecast to reach 40 meters per second. Sustained. Not a gust, not a momentary spike, but a steady, grinding 40 meters per second of wind pressing on everything in its path. And layered on top of that sustained wind, the forecast warns of instantaneous gusts that could exceed 60 meters per second. Let me put that number in terms you can feel. 60 meters per second is roughly 216 kilometers an hour. That is a gust strong enough to destroy a roof, to throw a vehicle, to strip a wall. That is the number Japan has published for what could hit the Sakishima Islands in the dark hours between July 10th and July 11th. And that is why, even as the word weakening floats around this storm, the people in its path are being told to prepare for the worst night they have seen in years. What makes this staircase of wind speed so instructive is that it lets you feel the storm arriving in stages, each one a warning that the next will be worse. The 15 meters per second of the morning is the kind of wind that is merely unpleasant, that makes you lean into it and keep an eye on loose objects. The 30 meter per second gusts of the afternoon are the kind that start doing real damage, tearing at anything not secured, making it genuinely dangerous to be outside. And the 40 meter per second sustained winds of the closest approach, with their 60 meter per second gusts, are in a different world entirely. The kind of wind that structures are tested against, that determines whether a roof stays on a building. The forecast is essentially a countdown through these thresholds, and the people reading it can measure their remaining time by which step of the staircase the wind has reached. That is exactly why the timing of the forecast matters as much as the numbers themselves. The escalation is not random. It is the predictable consequence of a storm drawing steadily closer, its strongest winds wrapped around a centre that is itself approaching. So each stage gives the islands a way to track how close the worst is, and to make their final decisions accordingly. By the time the 30 meter per second gusts arrive, the window for any last preparation has essentially closed, and everyone needs to be where they intend to ride out the storm. The staircase is not just a description of the wind, it is a schedule for survival, and the people of the Sakishima Islands are living by it right now. The wind is only half of the threat. After Bavi makes its closest approach, the forecast turns to water. Extremely heavy rain of more than 50 millimeters an hour becomes possible, especially around the Sakishima Islands, once the storm is closest and beginning to move past. 50 millimeters an hour is a punishing rate of rainfall, the kind that overwhelms drainage, floods low ground, and, on steep island terrain, can set loose the slope failures that so often turn out to be the deadliest part of a tropical system. So the picture Japan is holding tonight is not a single hazard. It is wind and rain, and high waves and storm surge arriving together, stacked on top of one another, aimed at a narrow strip of islands that cannot get out of the way. It helps to translate these wind speeds out of the language of meters per second and into things you can actually picture, because the numbers only mean something once you feel them. A sustained wind of 40 meters per second is a wind of roughly 144 kilometers an hour that does not let up, hour after hour, leaning on every wall and roof and tree with relentless pressure. It is not a gust that comes and goes. It is a constant grinding force, and constant force is what finds the weak point in a structure and works at it until it fails. Now add the gusts on top of that, the sudden surges past 60 meters per second, each one a hammer blow arriving without warning on top of the steady push. That combination, the relentless lean plus the sudden hammer, is what makes a windfield like Bavi's so destructive. The wind is not even the whole assault, and this is where the exposure of these islands compounds everything. The same storm driving that wind is also pushing the ocean ahead of it, piling water up against the coasts as storms surge and driving high waves onto the shore. On a small island with a long coastline and nowhere for the water to go, that marine threat can be as dangerous as anything happening in the air. Low-lying coastal areas can flood, harbours can be battered, and the sea can reach places it normally never touches. So when I say the Sakishima Islands are being asked to withstand this storm, I mean they are being asked to stand in a screaming wind, under punishing rain, while the ocean itself rises up against their shores, all at the same time, through the dark hours of a single night. This is the part of the story where I want to slow down and make sure the scale has landed, because it is easy to hear a string of numbers and let them wash past. So consider what these islands are being asked to withstand. They are being asked to stand in a wind that averages 40 meters per second and gusts past 60, under rain falling faster than 50 millimeters an hour, while the sea piles up against their coasts. That is the reality behind the calm, bureaucratic phrase "very intense typhoon," and every hour that Bavi keeps grinding toward the northwest, that reality gets closer. The storm that crossed an ocean is now close enough that Japan can count the hours until it arrives, and the people on those islands have already started doing something that tells you how seriously they are taking it. They have started shutting the islands down. Part 3. The islands go quiet. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over an island before a major storm, and the Sakishima Islands have already begun to fall into it. You can measure that silence in the things that have stopped. The flights have stopped. The ferries have stopped. The beaches have closed. And every one of those cancellations is a small, deliberate decision made by people who have looked at the same forecast we just walked through and concluded that the only safe move is to close the doors and wait. This is what it looks like when a community takes a storm seriously, and it is happening right now, in the hours before Bavi arrives. On Ishigaki, the island's Disaster Prevention Division has been working the problem for 3 straight days. That detail matters more than it might seem. 3 days of meetings, 3 days of coordinating evacuation shelter arrangements, 3 days of getting the word out to residents, all of it happening before the first serious gust even reaches the island. This is not a last-minute scramble. This is a community that saw what was coming far enough out to prepare methodically and chose to spend that time getting ready rather than hoping the storm would turn. The city closed its popular Painohama beach through the weekend. It cancelled medical checkups that had been scheduled for residents. Small decisions, each one, but together they paint the picture of an island clearing its decks for a fight. Consider what island isolation really means in practical terms, because it is easy to say and harder to fully picture. For the duration of Bavi's passage, the Sakishima Islands will be, for all practical purposes, unreachable. No plane can land in that wind, no ferry can cross that sea. If something goes wrong during the storm, a medical emergency, a structural failure, a person in trouble, the ordinary lifelines that connect these islands to the resources of mainland Japan will be severed. Help cannot fly in. People cannot be evacuated out. The island and everyone on it become a closed system for the length of the storm, dependent entirely on what and who is already there. That is a sobering thing to accept in advance, and it is exactly what the cancellation of every flight and every ferry represents. This is why the preparation has to be so complete before the storm arrives, and why the early timing of it matters so much. Everything the islands will need to get through Bavi and its immediate aftermath has to be in place beforehand, because once the storm is on top of them, nothing new is coming. The shelters have to be stocked, the emergency supplies have to be gathered, the plans have to be made and understood. There are no second chances once the wind is up, no opportunity to fix an oversight or fetch a forgotten necessity. The 3 days of methodical preparation were about exactly this, about making sure that when the islands seal themselves off and face the storm alone, they have everything they need to endure the isolation as well as the wind. The transportation shutdown is where the seriousness becomes unmistakable. Some Japan Airlines flights and all flights operated by the other major Japanese carrier, in and out of both Ishigaki and Naha airports, were cancelled. Ferry service in and out of Ishigaki port was cancelled through Saturday, and when you cancel the flights and the ferries, you are doing something profound to an island. You're cutting it off. You're accepting that for a stretch of hours this place will be on its own, unreachable by air or by sea, riding out whatever Bavi brings with only the supplies and the shelter already in place. Island isolation is one of the quiet dangers of a storm like this. It is not just the wind and the rain. It is the fact that while the storm is on top of you, no help is coming in and no one is getting out. The bridge to the outside world is the sky and the sea, and Bavi has closed them both. It is easy, watching a storm from a distance, to reduce it to a track on a map and a set of statistics, and to lose sight of the fact that at the end of that track are people whose ordinary lives are about to be interrupted by something extraordinary. Behind every cancelled flight is a traveller stranded or a family reunion postponed. Behind every closed shelter door is a group of neighbours who will spend a frightening night together, listening to the wind. Behind the calm phrasing of the forecast are parents reassuring children, elderly residents being checked on, shopkeepers boarding up storefronts built by their families over generations. The storm is a physical phenomenon, but its meaning is entirely human, measured in the disruption and fear and resilience of the people in its path. That human dimension is precisely why the stakes of the timing question feel so heavy. If Bavi weakens in time, these communities face a hard night and a difficult cleanup, but they come through it. If it does not, the consequences could reach into the very fabric of these towns, into homes and livelihoods, and, in the worst case, lives. The difference between those outcomes is not abstract to the people on Ishigaki. It is the difference between a storm they will talk about and a storm they will grieve, and they have no control over which one arrives, only over how well they prepare for the possibility of the worse one. That is the quiet weight the Sakishima Islands are carrying tonight, and it is why their methodical, unglamorous preparation deserves so much respect. This is the human shape of the story, and it is why the numbers we walk through matter so much. 40 meters per second is not an abstraction to the people boarding up their homes on Ishigaki tonight. 60 meter per second gusts are not a statistic to a family checking that their shelter plan still holds. These are the people at the end of Bavi's week-long journey, and they are the reason this particular chapter of the storm's life is the one worth telling. A storm over open water is a spectacle. A storm bearing down on a community that has already shut down its airports is something else. It is a threat with an address and a clock, and I keep coming back to that clock because the timeline here is brutally short. This is not a storm that is days away, giving everyone a comfortable margin to prepare and reconsider. Bavi's closest approach is within roughly 24 to 36 hours of the advisories the islands are working from tonight. That compressed window is itself part of the danger. When the flights and ferries are already cancelled and the shelters are already being readied, and the storm is still barrelling toward you at 20 kilometers an hour, there is no more time to plan. There is only time to finish. The people of the Sakishima Islands are in the finishing hours right now, the last stretch before a very intense typhoon arrives in the dark. Consider what it actually takes for a community to reach this state of readiness, because the calm efficiency of it can hide how much work and how much resolve it represents. 3 days before the storm, while Bavi was still a distant threat on a map, the people responsible for these islands were already in meetings, already working out which shelters would open, already deciding how to get the warnings to every resident. Families were already checking their emergency supplies, the water and food and batteries that have to last through the isolation, because once the storm arrives there is no running to the store and no ferry bringing in more. This is preparation as a way of life, built into the rhythm of living on an exposed island in a storm corridor, and it is being executed now with the seriousness that only genuine danger commands. There is a quiet courage in that kind of preparation, and it is worth naming. The people of the Sakishima Islands are not panicking and they are not pretending the threat is not real. They are doing the hard, unglamorous work of getting ready, methodically, without drama, in the hours before a very intense typhoon arrives, and the fact that they are doing it so thoroughly, that they shut down the airports and the ferries early and closed the beaches and readied the shelters days in advance, is itself a message about how seriously Bavi should be taken. These are people who know storms, who have lived through them before, and they are treating this one with real respect. That should tell you something. When the people closest to the danger prepare this hard, the rest of us should pay attention. So that is where Japan stands tonight. The forecast is published, the numbers are severe, the islands are shutting down, and the storm is closing in. But there is a wrinkle in this story that has been sitting underneath everything I have told you so far, and it is time to pull it into the light. Because if you were watching the headlines about Bavi over the last day, you would have seen a word attached to it again and again, a word that sounds like good news, a word that sounds like relief. That word is weakening. And I am about to explain why, in this particular case, it might be the most misleading word in the entire forecast. Part 4. The word that's misleading everyone. If you scanned the coverage of Bavi over the last day, you almost certainly saw it described as weakening, and in the narrowest technical sense that is true. Bavi is not the storm it was at its absolute peak. It has come down from the ceiling it briefly touched. But I need you to sit with a hard truth about tropical cyclones, because it is the truth this entire chapter of the story turns on. A weakening storm is not the same thing as a safe storm. A storm can shed its most extreme wind speeds and still be, by any measure that matters to the people underneath it, one of the most violent events those people will ever live through. Weakening tells you the direction the storm is trending. It tells you nothing about whether it will hurt you. Think about what weakening actually means here. Bavi peaked as a monster, a Category 5 system with winds that we will get to in a moment, and it is now easing back from that extreme. But easing back from a Category 5 does not leave you with a gentle storm. It leaves you with the sub-950 hectopascal system, now aimed at Japan, still carrying sustained winds near 180 kilometers an hour, still forecast to deliver 40 meter per second winds and 60 meter per second gusts to the Sakishima Islands. The forecast we walk through, with all its frightening numbers, is the forecast for the weakening storm. That is what weakening looks like in Bavi's case. The word promises relief that the numbers simply do not deliver. The people whose job it is to communicate these forecasts face a real dilemma with a word like weakening, and it is worth appreciating. On one hand, they have to be accurate, and it is accurate to say the storm is coming down from its peak. On the other hand, they know that the word can be misheard as reassurance, that some people will take weakening to mean safe and let their guard down at exactly the wrong moment. So responsible forecasters end up doing something that can seem almost contradictory, telling you a storm is weakening while simultaneously telling you to prepare for a life-threatening event. Both statements are true at the same time, and holding them together is the key to understanding Bavi correctly. The trap is in treating intensity as a single ladder, where any step down is a step towards safety. It is not. A storm coming down from a Category 5 peak can still be an extremely dangerous major storm, because the distance from the very top of the scale to merely catastrophic is not very far at all. Bavi weakening does not mean Bavi becoming safe. It means Bavi becoming slightly less extreme than the almost unimaginable extreme it briefly reached. And slightly less than unimaginable is still far, far beyond what an exposed island can shrug off. That is the reframing the Sakishima Islands have clearly internalized, and it is the reframing anyone watching this storm needs to hold on to, as the word weakening keeps floating past in the coverage. This is where the psychology of a storm becomes genuinely dangerous. When people hear that a storm is weakening, something in them relaxes. The threat feels like it is passing, like the worst has been avoided, like the preparations might have been an overreaction, and that relaxation, in the specific case of a storm like Bavi, can get people hurt. Because the storm heading for Japan does not care what word the headlines have attached to it. It is going to arrive with whatever wind and rain it still has, and whatever it still has is more than enough to devastate an exposed island. The gap between the reassuring word and the frightening reality is exactly where the risk lives. History is full of storms that taught this lesson the hard way, storms that were technically past their peak when they came ashore and still left devastation behind. A storm does not have to be at its record intensity to destroy a community. It only has to be strong enough, and the threshold for strong enough is far lower than the extremes that make headlines. A weakening storm that arrives carrying 40 meter per second winds is still, by any reasonable measure, a major disaster waiting to happen. The peak that Bavi has come down from was almost incomprehensibly violent. Coming down from incomprehensibly violent still leaves you with genuinely violent, and genuinely violent is more than enough to tear apart an exposed island. This is why the word weakening has to be handled so carefully, and why responsible forecasters are working so hard to make sure it does not become an excuse for complacency. The danger is not that the word is factually wrong. The danger is that it carries an emotional cargo it has not earned. Weakening sounds like relief. It sounds like the threat is passing. But in Bavi's case, the storm is weakening from a level so extreme that even the diminished version is a serious threat to life and property. The islands understand this, which is why they are not standing down. And to understand why they are right not to, you have to look inside the storm at what is actually happening to it. Because the very process that is trimming its peak wind is doing something else at the same time, something that can make the storm more dangerous to more people rather than less. So why is Bavi weakening at all? What is actually happening inside this storm as it turns toward Japan? The answer involves two forces working on it at once, and understanding them is the key to understanding the one question this whole story hangs on. The first force is the ocean itself, and whether it will keep feeding the storm or finally starve it. The second force is happening inside Bavi's own structure, in the ring of thunderstorms around its eye, and it is doing something counterintuitive and important. It is a process that can lower the storm's top wind speed while making it more dangerous to more people at the same time. To see how that works, we have to go inside the storm, to the part of it that does the damage, the eye wall. Part 5. Inside the eye wall. To understand why a weakening Bavi can still be so dangerous, you have to understand the part of the storm where the real violence lives. That part is the eye wall, the ring of towering thunderstorms that surrounds the calm eye at the centre. The eye wall is where a typhoon concentrates its strongest winds, a tight, screaming band of air rotating around the core. When you hear that a storm has a certain peak wind speed, you are really hearing about the eye wall. It is the engine and the weapon at the same time, and Bavi's eye wall has been doing something that explains both why the storm is weakening and why that weakening is such cold comfort for Japan. Bavi has been going through what meteorologists call an eye wall replacement cycle. Here is what that means in plain terms. In a very intense storm, the original tight inner eye wall can become surrounded by a second, larger ring of thunderstorms forming farther out. That outer ring slowly chokes off the inner one, cutting it off from the warm, moist air it needs, until the inner eye wall collapses and the outer ring takes over as the new eye wall. It is the storm rebuilding itself around a wider core. And this process has a very specific pair of effects that matter enormously for anyone in the storm's path. It usually brings the peak wind speed down. But it almost always makes the storm bigger. To visualize what is happening, picture the storm from above. At the center is the eye, and wrapped around it is the original eye wall, the tight ring where the strongest winds live. As the storm matures, bands of thunderstorms farther out can organize themselves into a second, larger ring, a kind of outer wall forming around the inner one. For a time, the storm has two concentric rings of intense weather, but they compete for the same supply of warm, moist inflowing air, and the outer ring, being larger, gradually wins, strangling the inner eye wall until it withers and collapses. What is left is the outer ring, now serving as the storm's new and wider eye wall. The storm has effectively rebuilt itself on a larger footprint. The consequence of that rebuild is the crucial thing. During the transition, the storm's peak winds usually ease, because the tight, efficient inner core that concentrated the highest speeds has broken down. That is the weakening. But the new, wider eye wall spreads strong winds across a much broader area than the old compact core ever did. So the storm emerges from the process with a lower maximum, but a larger reach. And for anyone standing in its path, the larger reach can matter more than the lower maximum. A wider storm holds you in damaging winds longer, drives more water ahead of it, and touches more of the island chain at once. This is why I keep insisting that a weakening Bavi is not a reassuring Bavi. The very process lowering its headline number is broadening the footprint of its assault on the Ryukyu Islands. Sit with that combination for a second, because it is the whole point. The eye wall replacement cycle is the reason Bavi's top wind number has come off its peak. That is the weakening you have been hearing about. But the very same process is spreading Bavi's damaging winds across a wider and wider area. The storm is trading a small, ferociously intense core for a broader, slightly less extreme one. And for a set of islands directly in the path, that trade can actually be worse, not better. A tiny, vicious storm might rake you with its worst winds for a short window, as the narrow core passes. A larger storm holds you in damaging winds for longer, pushes more water ahead of it as surge, and spreads its reach so that more of the island chain feels the force at once. Weaker at the centre, broader at the edges, more dangerous in the ways that count to more people. This is why I keep hammering on that word weakening, and why the people of the Sakishima Islands are not letting it lull them into anything. The forecast field of gale-force winds around Bavi is expansive, forecast to stretch across a broad area reaching from Taiwan all the way to Okinawa. That is not the footprint of a shrinking storm. That is the footprint of a storm that has spread out as it matured, exactly as an eyewall replacement cycle would predict. So when Japan tells its southern islands to prepare for 40 meter per second sustained winds, it is describing a storm that has grown into its threat even as its peak has eased. Bavi headed for Japan is a wider machine than the one that peaked days ago, and a wider machine touching more ground is not a reason to relax. It is worth pausing on the eye itself, because it is one of the most deceptive features of a storm like this. At the centre of Bavi sits a pocket of calm, a region where the winds fall away and the sky can even clear, ringed by the violence of the eye wall. When Bavi was at its most organised, that eye measured around 33 kilometres across, about 21 miles, a clean and symmetrical window at the centre of the storm. And that calm centre has fooled people for as long as storms have made landfall. When the eye passes over a location, the wind suddenly drops, the roar fades, and it can feel as though the storm has passed. It has not. On the far side of that calm is the other half of the eye wall, and it arrives with the wind coming from the opposite direction, often catching people who ventured out during the lull. If Bavi's eye passes near or over any of the Sakishima Islands, that treacherous calm is part of what the residents will have to understand and resist. The size of that eye and the eye wall around it also speaks to the point about a broadening storm. A tight, compact storm has a small eye and a narrow band of destruction. As a storm goes through the reorganization we are discussing, the eye can grow and the ring of strongest winds can widen, and that means the window of severe conditions gets larger, both in space and in time. A location caught under a wide eye wall endures the worst winds for longer than it would under a compact one. So the same structural change that eases Bavi's absolute peak is stretching out the duration of the punishment for anyone in its path. The storm is trading intensity for endurance, and for an island that cannot move out of the way, endurance may be the crueler of the two. But there is one more layer to Bavi's weakening that we have to confront, and it is maybe the most unsettling of all, because it is not about how strong the storm is. It is about how well anyone actually knows how strong the storm is. Because for all the precise-sounding numbers I have given you tonight, there is a genuine question mark hanging over every single one of them, and it comes down to the fact that nobody has flown into this storm to measure it. Part 6. The Storm Nobody Can Measure. Here is something that surprises most people when they first learn it. When a major hurricane threatens the United States, aircraft fly directly into it. Specially equipped planes punch through the eye wall, drop instruments into the core, and radio back hard measurements of exactly how low the pressure is and exactly how fast the wind is blowing. Those flights turn a storm from an estimate into a measurement. But out here, in the Western Pacific where Bavi lives, those flights do not happen. There is no routine hurricane hunter reconnaissance for typhoons in this part of the ocean, and that absence sits underneath every number I have quoted you tonight, because it means that almost everything we know about Bavi's intensity comes from looking at it from space rather than flying into it. The main tool for judging a storm's strength from space is a technique built around reading satellite imagery, matching the storm's appearance, the shape of its eye, the symmetry of its clouds, the temperature of its cloud tops, against a catalogue of what storms of known strength have looked like. It is a genuinely clever method, refined over decades, and skilled analysts get remarkably good results from it. But it is fundamentally an estimate. It is pattern matching from a distance, not a thermometer in the core. And that means every intensity number attached to Bavi carries an error bar, a margin of uncertainty about how strong the storm really is at any given moment. When the storm is turning toward a set of populated islands, that uncertainty stops being an academic footnote and becomes a real problem for the people trying to decide how hard to brace. It is remarkable when you think about it, how much of what we confidently state about a storm like Bavi rests on interpretation rather than direct measurement. Decades of work have gone into refining the art of reading a storm's strength from its appearance in satellite imagery, correlating the patterns, the symmetry of the clouds, the definition of the eye, the temperature of the cloud tops, with the intensities of past storms that were directly measured. It is a genuine science, and in skilled hands it produces impressively reliable results. But it remains, at its core, an inference, a best estimate of the hidden reality inside the storm based on the visible signs on its surface. And an estimate, however good, is not the same as a measurement, especially at the extreme upper end of intensity, where small differences in interpretation translate into large differences in stated strength. For the people making decisions on the ground, that gap between estimate and measurement has a very practical consequence. It means they cannot calibrate their response to a precise expected value, because the precise value does not exist, only a range with real uncertainty around it. And in a situation where being underprepared can cost lives, the only responsible way to handle that uncertainty is to plan for the stronger end of the range. This is not alarmism. It is the rational response to genuinely incomplete information about a genuinely dangerous threat. The Sakishima Islands are preparing for a serious storm not because they know exactly how strong Bavi will be, but precisely because they cannot know, and the plausible range includes outcomes severe enough that nothing less than full preparation would be wise. There is a second wrinkle that makes the numbers even slipperier, and it is worth understanding because it explains why you will sometimes see two very different wind speeds quoted for the same storm. Different weather agencies measure wind over different lengths of time. Japan's agency reports sustained winds averaged over 10 minutes. The American Military Center, that also tracks these storms, reports winds averaged over just 1 minute. And because a 1-minute average catches more of the brief peaks than a 10-minute average does, the American number for the exact same storm runs roughly 12 to 14% higher. Neither one is wrong. They are measuring the same wind through different windows. But to someone reading the coverage, it can look like the experts cannot agree on how strong Bavi is, when really they are just using different rulers. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of gap where bad ideas love to grow. When people notice that the intensity numbers carry uncertainty, and that different sources quote different figures, some of them leap to the conclusion that the truth is being hidden, that forecasters know something they are not saying, that the real strength of the storm is being covered up. And I understand the instinct, but the honest reality is so much simpler and so much less sinister. The uncertainty is not a cover-up. It is a limitation of the tools. Nobody has flown into Bavi, so everybody is estimating, and estimates from a distance disagree at the edges. That is not a conspiracy. That is just the hard truth of measuring a storm you can only watch from space. To appreciate how strange this measurement gap is, compare it to how the United States handles a major hurricane threatening its own coast. When a powerful hurricane approaches Florida or the Gulf Coast, aircraft fly repeated missions straight into the storm, punching through the eye wall multiple times a day, releasing instruments that fall through the core radioing back the actual pressure and the actual wind at every level. By the time that storm makes landfall, forecasters know its intensity with real precision because they have physically flown into it and measured it. That is the gold standard, and it exists for storms threatening American shores. It simply does not exist as a routine matter for typhoons in the Western Pacific like Bavi. The storm bearing down on Japan is being judged almost entirely from hundreds of kilometers away by eyes in orbit. There is a further irony in this measurement gap that is worth naming. We live in an age of extraordinary technological reach, an age in which we can watch a storm from space in remarkable detail, track its every movement, model its future path with computers of staggering power. And yet, for a storm like Bavi in this part of the ocean, we still cannot answer the simplest and most important question with certainty, which is exactly how strong it is right now. All our satellites and models orbit around an unmeasured core, offering us a detailed portrait of a storm whose central truth remains an estimate. It is a humbling reminder that for all our tools, nature still holds some of its most consequential secrets close, revealing them only when the storm finally arrives and shows us directly. For the islands, that irony has a hard edge. It means that even in an age of forecasting sophistication, they are still, in the end, meeting the storm somewhat blind, preparing for a range of possibilities rather than a known quantity. And it means that the old wisdom, prepare for the worst and hope for the best, remains as relevant as ever, because the technology has not eliminated the uncertainty, only narrowed it. The Sakishima Islands are doing exactly what generations of island communities have always done in the face of an approaching storm of uncertain strength, which is to ready themselves as completely as they can and then wait to see what the sea and the sky actually send. In that sense, despite all our modern instruments, the fundamental human situation in front of a great storm has not changed at all. This is not a criticism of the forecasters, who are doing genuinely excellent work with the tools they have. The satellite techniques are sophisticated, and the analysts are skilled, and the forecasts Japan has issued are, if anything, admirably clear and appropriately alarming. The point is simply that a margin of uncertainty is baked into the situation, unavoidably, by the absence of direct measurement, and that margin is precisely why the islands cannot fine-tune their preparations to some exact expected intensity. They cannot say, well, it will be exactly this strong, so we will prepare exactly this much. They have to prepare for the stronger end of the plausible range, because the tools cannot rule that stronger end out. Uncertainty, in a situation like this, always has to be resolved in favour of caution, and the people of the Sakishima Islands are resolving it exactly that way. So layer all of this together, and you start to see why Bavi is such an unnerving storm to stand in front of. It is weakening, but weakening does not mean safe. Its eye wall has rebuilt into something wider, spreading its winds across more of the island chain rather than less. And the exact strength it will carry to Japan's doorstep is knowable only within a margin, because no instrument has touched its core. The people on the Sakishima Islands are preparing for a storm whose precise ferocity will only become clear once it is already screaming across Ishigaki. And if you want to understand just how much ferocity this storm is capable of carrying, you do not have to imagine it. You only have to look at what Bavi did a few days ago to another set of islands under another nation's flag. Because before Japan, there was Rota. Part 7. What Bavi did to Rota. A few days before Japan started cancelling its ferries, a small island in the middle of the Pacific found itself directly under the eye of this same storm, and what happened there is the reason you should take every word of the Japan forecast seriously. That island is Rota, part of the Northern Mariana Islands, a United States Commonwealth scattered across the Western Pacific. On July 6th, Bavi crossed those islands not as a weakening system, but at the very height of its power, as a Category 5 super typhoon, the most extreme classification a tropical cyclone can hold. And Rota did not get a glancing blow. Rota took a direct hit from the eye. The numbers Bavi carried to Rota are the numbers that should make Japan's forecast feel real rather than abstract. When it struck, Bavi was driving maximum sustained winds near 290 km per hour. That is roughly 180 miles per hour of sustained wind. Its central pressure had dropped to around 910 millibars. To put that in the context of what we have been discussing, remember that a pressure below 950 is already the mark of a fiercely intense storm. Bavi hit Rota at 910. This was Bavi at its most dangerous, a high-end Category 5, the third storm anywhere on the planet in 2026 to reach that most extreme tier. And it put its eye directly over an inhabited island. The aftermath on Rota is what a direct strike from a storm like this actually looks like on the ground, stripped of all the abstraction of wind speed numbers. Rota sustained the worst damage in the entire Commonwealth. Critical infrastructure was battered, roads were blocked, the island's ports suffered damage, power went down, the water system was hit. This is the full cascade of a maximum intensity typhoon coming ashore over a community. The way the wind does not just break individual things but unravels the systems a modern island depends on. The electricity and the clean water and the roads and the harbour all at once, in a single violent night. And the reason I am walking you through Rota in detail is not to dwell on one island's misfortune. It is because Rota is the proof of concept. Rota is what this exact storm, this exact Bavi, is capable of when it reaches land. It is worth remembering that the Marianas were not caught off guard by a storm out of nowhere, and that Bavi's assault on that region was part of a larger punishing pattern. These islands sit in the same Western Pacific corridor that breeds the world's most powerful typhoons, and they have faced extreme storms before. Guam, the largest and most populous of the Mariana Islands, and its neighbours Rota, Tinian and Saipan, are home to a couple 100,000 American citizens and nationals, communities that have learned to live with the threat of these systems. But even a region hardened by experience found itself facing something at the very top of the scale when Bavi arrived, a Category 5 bearing down on islands that had already been through a brutal stretch of storm activity. Familiarity with typhoons did not make Bavi any less catastrophic when its eye came ashore. That is the sobering lesson the Marianas offer to Japan tonight. Being experienced with storms, being prepared, being tough, none of it changes the physics of what a maximum intensity typhoon does when it makes a direct hit. Rota did everything a community can do and still lost its power, its water, and the use of its roads and port, because there are forces that preparation can help you survive but cannot prevent from causing damage. The Sakishima Islands are every bit as experienced and every bit as prepared as the Marianas were, and that is genuinely to their credit, but it does not make them immune. It makes them ready to survive, which is not the same as ready to escape unscathed. And that distinction is exactly why the same storm now sends a chill through Japan. Now, here is the connection that should send a chill down your spine as Japan braces tonight. The storm that did that to Rota is the same storm now turning toward the Sakishima Islands. Yes, it has come down from that Category 5 peak. Yes, it is the weakening storm we have spent so much time discussing, but the machine that flattened Rota's infrastructure is the same machine now aimed at Ishigaki, and the gap between what it was over Rota and what it will be over Japan is smaller than the word weakening makes it sound. When Japan's forecasters warn of 60 meter per second gusts, they are not speculating about some theoretical storm. They are describing the tail end of the same system that put its eye over a United States Commonwealth and left it without power, water, or open roads. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what the label Category 5 actually signifies, because it is the top of the scale for a reason. There is no Category 6. Category 5 is the classification reserved for storms with sustained winds above a threshold that marks the onset of catastrophic, near-total destruction, and most storms never come anywhere close to it. In a typical year, only a small handful of storms across the entire planet reach that tier, and many years see even fewer. Bavi reaching Category 5 made it the third storm anywhere on Earth in 2026 to do so, and it struck the Northern Mariana Islands while it was there, at the very summit of its power. That is the storm that put its eye over Rota. Not a strong storm, not even a merely dangerous storm, the most extreme category that exists, delivered directly onto an inhabited island. And the Northern Mariana Islands are not some abstract distant place. They are a commonwealth of the United States, home to American citizens and nationals, communities with schools and hospitals and harbours and power grids, the ordinary infrastructure of modern life. When Bavi came ashore there as a Category 5, it was not testing itself against empty rock. It was testing itself against a real community, and the community lost power, lost water, lost the use of its roads and its port. That is the concrete meaning of a direct Category 5 strike, and it happened only days ago to real people, under the same storm now approaching Japan. Rota is not a statistic. It is a warning written in the recent past in a language the Sakishima Islands can read perfectly well. This is why the recent memory of Rota matters so much for understanding the fear around Japan tonight. It would be one thing to hear a forecast full of alarming numbers for a storm that had not yet proven itself. It is another thing entirely when that storm has, within the same week, already delivered a direct Category 5 strike to an inhabited island and left devastation behind. Bavi does not need to be imagined. It has a track record, and that track record is only a few days old. The people of the Sakishima Islands know exactly what is bearing down on them, because they can look at what happened to Rota and understand that the same storm is now hours from their own coasts. And that leads to something genuinely remarkable about Bavi's journey, something that underscores just how far and how destructively this single storm has travelled. Part 8. One storm, 2 flags, 1 week. Step back from the hour-by-hour forecast for a moment and consider the sheer scope of what this one storm is doing. Within a single week, Bavi is delivering direct damaging strikes to inhabited islands under 2 different national flags on opposite sides of the Western Pacific. On July 6th, it struck American soil, the Northern Mariana Islands, as a Category 5. By the night of July 10th into July 11th, it is forecast to strike Japanese soil, the Sakishima Islands, as a very intense typhoon, 1 storm, 2 nations, roughly 4 to 5 days apart. That is not a common thing, and it tells you something about the scale and the endurance of this system that a simple daily forecast can miss. Most tropical cyclones live and die within a fairly contained stretch of ocean. They form, they intensify, they strike somewhere or curve out to sea, and they fade. Bavi has done something bigger. It has carved a track long enough to menace territory belonging to 2 of the largest nations bordering the Pacific, staying dangerous the entire way. When it crossed the Marianas, it was near its peak. When it reaches Japan, it will still be carrying enough power to justify shutting down islands and issuing forecasts full of 40 meter per second winds. The through line connecting Rota to Ishigaki is a single, persistent, powerful storm that has refused to let go of its intensity across an enormous span of ocean. That persistence is the real story of Bavi, and it is why this storm has earned so much attention across so many days. For the people caught along that track, the two strikes are not connected by geography or nationality but by the same brute physics. The family on Rota that lost power on July 6th and the family on Ishigaki boarding up on July 10th are living through different moments of the same storm's life. That is a strange and sobering kind of connection. It means that the devastation on Rota is not just a past event but a preview, a real-world demonstration of the forces now converging on Japan. Every hour of what Rota endured is information about what the Sakishima Islands are preparing for tonight. The storm wrote its resume on one island, and it is about to apply that same resume to another. The reason Bavi has been able to menace two nations across such a span of ocean comes back to the water it has been crossing. This corner of the Western Pacific is, more than almost anywhere else on the planet, built to sustain storms at extreme intensity for long distances. The ocean here is warm and the warmth reaches far below the surface, so a storm moving across it is continuously refueled, able to hold its strength or even rebuild it as it travels. Bavi rode that warm highway all the way from the Marianas toward Japan, and the highway is precisely why it did not simply fall apart after its first landfall, the way a storm over cooler water might have. The same ocean that let it reach Category 5 let it stay dangerous long enough to reach a second nation entirely. That endurance is what elevates Bavi from a single destructive event into something more like a campaign, a storm working its way across an entire region, hitting here, threatening there, spreading its reach over days rather than hours. And for everyone living along that path, the storm's persistence means the threat is not a single moment, but a moving front of danger, arriving at each new place in turn. Rota felt it. The Sakishima Islands are about to feel it. And as we will see, Taiwan and the coast of China are watching it come for them next. One warm ocean, one enduring storm, and a whole region taking its turn in the path. That is the scope of what Bavi is, and it is why the islands Japan is now defending site where they do, out on the exposed edge, in the way of a storm that refuses to quit. I want to make sure the human weight of this lands, because it is easy to get lost in the impressive scale of a storm that can strike two nations in a week and forget what that actually means. It means real communities, twice in a matter of days, facing the loss of the ordinary systems that make life work. It means the darkness of a night without power, the anxiety of a water system knocked offline, the isolation of an island cut off from the outside world. Rota lived that on July 6th. The Sakishima Islands are being told to prepare for their own version of it, on the night of July 10th. And the reason the same storm can do this twice, the reason it stayed strong enough for long enough to reach all the way from American territory to Japanese territory, comes down partly to the specific stretch of ocean it has been crossing, and partly to the specific geography it is now approaching. Because the islands Bavi is aiming at are not just any islands, they are some of the most exposed real estate in the entire Pacific. Part 9. The most exposed islands in the Pacific. To understand why Bavi's arrival at the Sakishima Islands is so alarming, you have to understand where these islands actually sit, and what that position means when a storm comes calling. The Sakishima Islands are the far southwestern tip of Japan, the last scattering of Japanese land before the ocean gives way to Taiwan. This is the Yaeyama region, with Ishigaki as its hub, a cluster of relatively small islands sitting out in open water at the edge of the East China Sea. And that position, out on the frontier, surrounded by warm ocean on every side, is exactly what makes them so vulnerable to a storm like this one. There is no larger landmass upstream to weaken an approaching typhoon, no protective barrier, nothing between these islands and the open sea a storm rides in on. Part of what makes these islands so exposed is simply their scale against the scale of the storm. Bavi's windfield, broadened by the reorganization it has undergone, spans a large fraction of the sea around it, an expanse of dangerous conditions reaching, by forecast, from Taiwan all the way to Okinawa. Set a small island group down inside a windfield that large, and the island does not deflect or diminish the storm in any meaningful way. It is simply enveloped. The storm does not have to aim precisely to strike these islands hard, because its reach is so much larger than the islands themselves. That mismatch between the smallness of the land and the enormity of the storm is a defining feature of the threat, and it is why even a track that does not score a perfect direct hit can still deliver punishing conditions across the whole Sakishima group. There is no high ground large enough, no sheltering range, no protective bulk of land to hide behind on an island this size. Whatever the storm brings, the island takes in full, from the first rising winds to the peak gusts to the flooding rain that follows. This is the fundamental vulnerability of small islands in the path of large storms, and it is the reason island communities in storm-prone regions have historically developed some of the most robust cultures of preparation anywhere. They have no choice. When the storm arrives, there is nowhere on the island that is truly safe from it, only structures built to endure and plans made to survive. And that is exactly the posture the Sakishima Islands hold tonight. A small and exposed set of communities readying themselves to absorb the full force of a storm far larger than the land they stand on. Geography is destiny when it comes to tropical cyclones, and the geography of the Sakishima Islands is the kind that offers no help. When a typhoon approaches a large continental coastline, it often begins to weaken as it interacts with land, its supply of warm ocean moisture cut off, its circulation disrupted by friction. But a small island out in open water gives a storm nothing to trip over. Bavi can carry its full strength right up to the shores of Ishigaki because there is nothing in the way to sap it. The islands sit exposed on all sides, which means they can be struck by the storm's winds regardless of which direction the system is moving, and it means the sea has a clean, open run to pile up against their coasts as surge and high waves. This is real estate with nowhere to hide. There is something almost stark about just how far out on the edge these islands sit. The Sakishima group lies at the very southwestern extremity of the Japanese archipelago, closer to Taiwan than to the Japanese main islands, out where the East China Sea meets the open Pacific. This is frontier territory in the most literal geographic sense, the last outposts of the nation before the sea takes over entirely. And that remoteness, beautiful and distinctive as it is in ordinary times, becomes a liability when a storm arrives, because it means these communities are far from the concentrated resources, the large hospitals, the heavy equipment, the emergency reserves that a major population centre could draw on. They are on their own not just during the storm but to a meaningful degree in its immediate aftermath as well. Self-reliance, then, is not a virtue these islands choose so much as a condition they inhabit. When you live this far out, you learn to prepare thoroughly because you cannot count on rescue arriving quickly. You build the habits of readiness into daily life because the alternative is unacceptable, and you develop a clear-eyed respect for the ocean and the sky because you face them with less of a buffer than almost anyone else in the country. All of that is on display right now in how the Sakishima Islands are meeting Bavi, in the early and complete preparations, in the willingness to shut everything down well ahead of the storm. It is the response of a community that understands, far down in its collective experience, exactly how exposed and how alone it is, and that has chosen to meet that reality with preparation rather than denial. The exposure is compounded by the isolation we talked about earlier, and now you can see how the two dangers feed each other. Because these islands sit far out on their own, cut off from the main body of Japan, they depend entirely on air and sea links to the outside world, the very links that a storm forces them to sever. So the same geography that leaves them exposed to the storm's full force also leaves them alone to face it. When Ishigaki closes its airport and its port, it is not just pausing travel. It is acknowledging that for the duration of Bavi's passage, this exposed frontier community is on its own, out at the edge of the map, with a very intense typhoon bearing down and no larger landmass to blunt the blow. That combination, maximum exposure and maximum isolation, is what makes the Sakishima Islands one of the more daunting places in the Pacific to face a storm of this size. There is a particular geometry to how a storm strikes an isolated island that makes it more dangerous than most people appreciate. When a typhoon approaches a large continent, the coastline gives some warning in the form of gradually building conditions, and the storm often begins to fray as it nears land. But a small island out in open water experiences something more like a switch being thrown. The storm arrives with its full marine strength intact, and because the island is surrounded by water on every side, there is no sheltered flank, no leeward safe zone that a larger landmass would provide. Whichever way Bavi is turning as it passes, some part of the Sakishima Islands will be facing directly into its worst winds. Exposure on all sides means there is no good place to be. The terrain of these islands adds another dimension to the danger, particularly when it comes to the rain. Islands like these are not flat. They have hills and slopes, and when a storm dumps rain at more than 50 millimeters an hour onto steep ground, already saturated by the leading bands of the system, that water has to go somewhere. It rushes downhill, gathering force, and it can loosen slopes into landslides and turn small streams into torrents. Some of the deadliest outcomes of tropical cyclones on mountainous islands come not from the wind at all, but from the water moving across the land afterward. So the exposure of the Sakishima Islands is not only about facing the wind from every direction, it is about being small, steep and surrounded, three qualities that together leave an island with remarkably little defence against a storm of Bavi's size. And this is not the first time these particular islands have found themselves in the path of a powerful Pacific system. The southern Ryukyu chain, of which Sakishima is a part, sits in one of the more active tropical cyclone corridors on the planet, the warm highway that storms ride as they curve up from the tropics toward East Asia. The people who live here know storms. They have a culture of preparation built on generations of experience with typhoons sweeping through. But knowing storms and facing a storm that struck a United States Commonwealth as a Category 5 a few days earlier are two different things. Experience helps. It does not make 40-metre-per-second winds any less dangerous. And it is worth understanding that this region's relationship with natural violence runs even further back than typhoons, because these same islands carry the memory of a catastrophe that came not from the sky but from the sea, a disaster that still shapes how this part of Japan thinks about the ocean at its doorstep. Part 10. The Sea's Longest Memory. The southern Ryukyu Islands carry a memory that runs further back than any single typhoon, and it is worth understanding tonight because it explains the particular respect these communities hold for the ocean pressing against their shores. In the year 1771, this exact stretch of Japan was struck by one of the most catastrophic tsunamis in the region's recorded history, an event remembered as the Yaeyama Great Tsunami, or the Meiwa Tsunami after the era in which it happened. It was not born of a storm. It came from the seafloor, from the violent tectonic machinery that lies beneath these waters, and it swept over the low coasts of the Yaeyama Islands, with a force that reshaped communities and killed on a scale this region has never forgotten. The islands Bavi is now approaching are islands that have already, once, watched the sea rise up and erase what stood in its way. The 1771 disaster left a mark on these islands that goes beyond the historical record, shaping the very way the communities relate to the sea. In the Yaeyama Islands, the memory of that event has been passed down across generations, a permanent reminder that the beautiful water surrounding these communities is also capable of terrible violence. Stones and markers, oral histories, and local knowledge preserve the awareness that the ocean once rose without warning and swept over the low ground, and that awareness has never entirely faded. It is the kind of collective memory that makes a community take every serious threat from the sea seriously, that removes any temptation to assume the water will always stay where it belongs, and that inherited caution is exactly the mindset that serves these islands well as Bavi approaches. A community that remembers a genuine catastrophe does not need to be persuaded to prepare. It does not roll its eyes at warnings or assume the forecasters are exaggerating. It has a built-in respect for the possibility that nature can, on rare and terrible occasions, exceed anything in recent experience. So when the warnings went out about Bavi, they landed on people already predisposed to take them seriously, already inclined to prepare thoroughly and early. The long memory of the sea is, in its way, a form of protection, and the Sakishima Islands are drawing on it now as they brace for a storm whose exact ferocity remains unknown. That older catastrophe matters to tonight's story not because a typhoon and a tsunami are the same thing, they are not, but because it reveals something about where these islands sit on the planet. The Sakishima and Yaeyama Islands are perched along the Ryukyu Trench, a long subduction zone where one great slab of the Earth's crust dives beneath another, one of the significant and frankly underwatched megathrust systems in the Western Pacific. It is the same tectonic setting that came up when we tracked an earlier super typhoon toward these very islands. The recognition that this is a place where the hazards of sky and sea and solid earth all overlap in the same narrow strip of land. The people here do not have the luxury of worrying about only one kind of disaster. They live at a crossroads of them. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is precisely the kind of overlap that invites bad thinking, and we will get to that bad thinking in a moment. The fact that Bavi is arriving over a seismically active subduction zone does not mean the storm will trigger an earthquake or a tsunami. There is no credible mechanism by which a typhoon, however violent, sets off a megathrust rupture. The pressure changes a storm brings, dramatic as they feel to us on the surface, are negligible against the colossal tectonic stresses locked up in a fault system like the Ryukyu Trench. What the 1771 tsunami tells us is not that Bavi will cause another one. It tells us that these islands have always lived on a dangerous edge, and that their relationship with the surrounding ocean has been shaped by genuine catastrophe. That history is part of why a community out here prepares the way it does, 3 days in advance, methodically, without the luxury of assuming the worst will pass them by. The layering of hazards in this one location is genuinely unusual, and it is worth understanding for what it reveals about life on this frontier. These islands sit in a tropical cyclone corridor, so they face typhoons. They sit atop a major subduction zone, so they face earthquakes and the tsunamis those earthquakes can spawn. The 1771 catastrophe was a demonstration of the second kind of threat, and Bavi is a demonstration of the first, and they happen to menace the very same strip of land. It is a place where the sky and the sea and the solid ground beneath all carry the capacity for violence, and where the people have had to build a way of living that keeps all of those threats in mind at once. That is not a burden most communities carry, and it shapes a certain hard-won wisdom about respecting nature's power. I raise the older disaster not to frighten, but to explain, because it illuminates why the response to Bavi has been so thorough and so early. A community that carries the memory of the sea rising up and erasing what stood before it does not gamble against the ocean. It does not assume the optimistic forecast. It prepares as if the worst is possible, because in this place, historically, the worst has sometimes been what arrived. So the 3 days of preparation, the early shutdown of the airports and ferries, the readied shelters, all of it flows from a culture that has learned, across centuries, not to underestimate what the surrounding water can do, and that hard-earned caution is exactly the right posture for a storm whose true strength at arrival remains even now uncertain. So when Bavi bears down on the Sakishima Islands tonight, it is bearing down on a place that carries the memory of the sea at its most destructive, and that knows better than most what it means to be a small island in a large and violent ocean. That memory is woven into how these communities respond, into the seriousness of the shelter plans and the willingness to shut down the airports and the ferries early. It is the accumulated wisdom of a place that has learned, sometimes at terrible cost, not to gamble against nature, and it sharpens the central question hanging over the next 24 hours, because a community this prepared, this experienced, this aware of the ocean's power, is telling you something by taking Bavi as seriously as it is. It is telling you this storm is worth fearing, and to understand why Bavi grew strong enough to earn that fear, we have to look at the water it has been travelling over, the warm ocean that built this monster and that will eventually be the thing that unmakes it. Part 11. The Ocean that Built a Monster. Every great storm is a bargain struck with the ocean, and to understand Bavi you have to understand the water that made it. A tropical cyclone is, at its core, an engine that runs on warm seawater. It draws heat and moisture up from the ocean surface, converts that energy into towering walls of thunderstorm and screaming wind, and the warmer and thicker the pool of warm water beneath it, the more fuel it has to burn. Bavi grew into the most powerful storm on Earth this year because it spent its life crossing some of the warmest, most energy-laden water on the planet, the tropical Western Pacific, a stretch of ocean that has earned a reputation as a factory for the world's most extreme typhoons. This is where the giants are born, and Bavi is one of the giants. What matters is not just the temperature of the sea surface, but the depth of the warm layer beneath it. When the warm water reaches far below the surface, a storm can churn and intensify without stirring up the cooler water below that would otherwise choke it. Bavi crossed exactly that kind of ocean, thick warm water with enormous heat content, and it responded the way the physics predicts, by strengthening into a high-end Category 5 with a central pressure that bottomed out around 910 millibars near the Marianas. The ceiling on how strong a storm can theoretically get in a given patch of ocean rises as the water warms, and the Western Pacific this year has been warm enough to lift that ceiling to frightening heights. It is not a coincidence that 2026 has already produced multiple Category 5 storms. When the ocean carries this much heat, it hands storms the raw material to reach their most dangerous extremes. It is worth understanding just how much energy is flowing through this system, because it puts the whole storm into perspective. A mature typhoon like Bavi is continuously converting the heat of the ocean into mechanical energy, into wind and waves and towering thunderstorms, at a rate that dwarfs human industry many times over. Every second, the storm draws up warm, moist air from the sea surface. That moisture condenses high in the atmosphere and releases its stored heat, and that heat drives the circulation faster, which draws up still more moist air. It is a self-reinforcing engine, and as long as the warm ocean keeps feeding it, the engine keeps running. This is why the Western Pacific, with its expanse of thick, warm water, is the most reliable birthplace of the planet's strongest storms. The fuel is simply more abundant here than almost anywhere else, and this year, the fuel has been unusually plentiful. The ocean that Bavi crossed has been carrying a heavy load of heat, warm not just at the surface but well down into the depths, and that abundance is reflected in the season's roster of extreme storms. When the water is this warm and this thick, storms that might otherwise top out at a moderate intensity can instead climb toward the very ceiling of what is physically possible, as Bavi did. It is the ocean, more than anything else, that determines how strong these storms can get, and the ocean this year has been primed to build them large. Bavi is the most dramatic expression of that so far, the strongest of them all, and understanding that it is a creature of the warm sea is the key to understanding both how it grew so powerful and why. As it approaches cooler water near Japan, its days at the top are numbered. But the same bargain that builds these storms also contains the seed of their undoing, and this is where Bavi's future gets genuinely interesting for Japan. A storm this powerful is only as strong as the warm water feeding it, and the moment it moves over cooler or shallower water, the fuel supply starts to fail, and the engine begins to wind down. And here is the crucial forecast detail for the Sakishima Islands. The favourable high ocean heat content that has sustained Bavi is forecast to fall sharply along the storm's path as it approaches Japan. The warm highway runs out. That is the mechanism behind the weakening we have been discussing all along. Not some mysterious loss of strength, but a very physical process of the storm running out of the thick, warm water it needs. Forecasters expect this to begin a terminal weakening phase around 36 hours out, and this is the razor's edge the entire story balances on. The question is one of timing. Will the warm water fail early enough and the weakening set in fast enough that Bavi arrives at the Sakishima Islands as a substantially diminished storm, or will Bavi hold its violent structure just long enough to rake Ishigaki and the Yaeyama Islands with its 40-metre-per-second winds before the cooler water finally pulls it apart afterward? That is not a settled question. It is the great uncertainty of this forecast, and it is why the islands cannot afford to bet on the optimistic version. If the warm layer along the final approach turns out to be thicker than the models expect, the weakening could stall and Bavi could arrive stronger than forecast. The ocean built this monster, and the ocean will eventually kill it. The only thing not yet decided is whether that killing blow lands before or after the storm reaches Japan. To really grasp why the ocean is both creator and destroyer here, it helps to think of a typhoon as a fire, and the warm water as its fuel. As long as the fire has fuel, it burns hot and grows. Take the fuel away, and no matter how enormous the blaze, it begins to die. The warm surface water of the tropical Pacific is that fuel, and the crucial subtlety is that the fuel has to be thick. A thin skin of warm water on top of cold depths gets churned up and exhausted quickly by a powerful storm, which mixes the cold water up from below and chokes itself. But where the warm layer runs thick, as it has along much of Bavi's path, the storm can burn and burn without exhausting its supply. That abundant warmth is what allowed Bavi to reach and hold the extreme intensity that made it the strongest storm of the year. The reason this year has produced storm after storm at the top of the scale, multiple Category 5 systems in a single year, comes back to how much heat the ocean has been holding. The theoretical maximum strength a storm can reach in a given patch of water rises as that water warms, and warmer, thicker warm layers mean the ceiling on possible intensity climbs higher. Bavi is one expression of an ocean carrying an unusual amount of heat, an ocean primed to build giants. And now that same ocean is setting the terms of Bavi's death, because the forecast calls for that abundant warmth to fall away sharply as the storm nears Japan. The fuel is about to thin. The only question, the question everything hinges on, is whether it thins fast enough to matter before Bavi reaches the islands, or whether the storm arrives still burning hot. That single question, the timing of Bavi's collapse against the timing of its closest approach, is the reason nobody on the Sakishima Islands is relaxing tonight, no matter how many headlines use the word weakening. Because the storm's own weakening is a race, and the finish line is Ishigaki. And while the forecasters and the modelers wrestle with that genuine physics-based uncertainty, another kind of story about Bavi has been spreading, one that has nothing to do with ocean heat content or eye wall replacement cycles and everything to do with the way human beings reach for someone to blame when nature turns violent. It is time to deal with the conspiracy theories, because a storm this big always drags them along in its wake. Part 12. The Stories People Tell About Storms. Whenever a storm this large aims itself at a populated coastline, a second storm forms alongside it, a storm of rumour and suspicion, and Bavi is no exception. So let us deal with it directly, because part of the job here is to look at the claims honestly rather than pretend they do not exist. The most common one, the one that resurfaces with every major typhoon, is the idea that the storm was deliberately created or steered by human beings, that some facility or secret program aimed Bavi at Japan on purpose. It is a claim that feels compelling to some people, precisely because a storm this powerful seems too enormous, too consequential, to be a mere accident of weather. Surely the thinking goes, something this destructive must have been directed. The problem with that idea is arithmetic. A mature typhoon like Bavi continuously releases energy on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend, on the order of 10 to the 14th or even 10 to the 15th watts. That is the power output of the storm running moment to moment, dwarfing the entire generating capacity of human civilization many times over. There is no facility, no technology, no secret program on Earth that can conjure, steer, or dissipate an energy budget like that. The notion that some antenna array or weather modification project could aim a storm of this magnitude collides head-on with the basic physics of how much energy is involved. Bavi's west-northwest track curving up toward East Asia is not the fingerprint of a hidden hand. It is the textbook response of a tropical cyclone to the large-scale steering currents of the atmosphere, the subtropical ridge nudging it along a path that thousands of storms before it have followed. The storm is going where the atmosphere is pushing it, nothing more. To really appreciate why the steered storm idea collapses, it helps to sit with the raw scale of the energy involved. The power a mature typhoon releases, on the order of 10 to the 14th or 10 to the 15th watts, is not merely large. It is larger than the total electrical generating capacity of all of human civilization combined, by a wide margin, and the storm sustains that output continuously for days on end. To create such a storm from nothing, or to nudge one this massive onto a chosen path, would require harnessing and directing an amount of energy that no technology on Earth comes remotely close to commanding. The idea is not just unproven, it runs headlong into the most basic accounting of how much energy a typhoon represents versus how much energy people can actually marshal. What actually steers a storm like Bavi is the large-scale architecture of the atmosphere itself, the sprawling zones of high and low pressure that set up the prevailing currents at the altitudes where a storm is embedded. A typhoon is carried along by those currents much as a leaf is carried by a river, and Bavi's west-northwest track curving up toward East Asia is the classic response of a storm caught on the edge of a subtropical ridge of high pressure. Thousands of storms before Bavi have followed nearly identical paths for exactly the same reason. There is nothing mysterious or directed about it. The storm is going where the atmosphere is pushing it, along a route so well understood that forecasters could sketch its general shape days in advance. No hidden hand is required to explain a storm behaving exactly as the physics says it should. There is a second claim, subtler and in a way more understandable, that forecasters are secretly hiding how strong Bavi really is. We actually touched the root of this earlier when we talked about the measurement problem, and it is worth connecting the dots. Because Bavi's intensity is estimated from satellite rather than measured by aircraft, and because different agencies quote different wind speeds using different averaging times, it can genuinely look like the experts are hedging or concealing something. But the honest explanation is the mundane one. The uncertainty is real, and it is a limitation of the tools, not evidence of a cover-up. Nobody flew into this storm, so everybody is estimating, and estimates carry error bars. The differing numbers are different rulers measuring the same wind, not a conspiracy to hide the truth. If anything, the official Japanese forecast errs toward alarming honesty, publishing 60 meter per second gust potential in plain language for anyone to read. And then there is the claim we set up in the last part, the one that tries to link Bavi's arrival over the Ryukyu Trench to earthquake or tsunami risk. The suggestion that a storm passing over a subduction zone might set off the tectonic machinery below. I want to close that door firmly. There is no established mechanism by which a typhoon triggers a megathrust earthquake. The stresses locked up in a fault system like the one beneath these islands are so enormous that the atmospheric changes a storm brings are, by comparison, a feather landing on a mountain. The 1771 tsunami and the storm bearing down tonight share a location on the map and nothing more. They are two separate hazards that happen to threaten the same beautiful, exposed, endangered strip of islands. There is a reason these stories cluster around every major storm, and it is worth understanding rather than simply dismissing. When something as enormous and threatening as Bavi bears down on people, the human mind reaches instinctively for agency, for the comfort of believing that a threat this large must have a cause we can name and, ideally, blame. A storm that is nobody's fault, that emerged from the blind interaction of sun and sea and wind and simply happens to be aimed at your home, is in some ways more frightening than a storm someone engineered, because it means no one is in control and no one can be held responsible. The conspiracy theories, strange as it sounds, offer a kind of dark comfort. They replace an indifferent universe with a responsible villain. But the honest reckoning with Bavi is more useful than any of that comfort, because it points to where accountability actually lies, which is in preparation and response rather than in imagined causes. Nobody can be blamed for creating Bavi, because nobody created it. What can be judged is how well we see it coming, how clearly we warn, how thoroughly communities prepare, and how quickly help arrives afterward. Those are the things within human control, and they are the things the Sakishima Islands have been getting right, with their early warnings and their methodical readiness. Chasing phantom weather machines is a distraction from the real and solvable work of facing a natural disaster well. The storm is real, its causes are natural, and the meaningful human response is the one already underway on those islands tonight. I spend time on these claims not to mock the people who find them persuasive, because the instinct behind them is human and old, the desire to find an agent, a cause, someone to hold responsible when the sky turns violent and lives are threatened. But the truth about Bavi is both simpler and, in its own way, more sobering than any conspiracy. No one aimed this storm. No one is hiding its strength. No one can call it off. It is a natural engine of almost unimaginable power, built by a warm ocean, steered by the winds, running down the same highway storms have always run, and it is about to reach a set of islands full of people who have done everything right to prepare. And once it finishes with Japan, it will not simply vanish. It has more of the map to cross, and more people downstream who are watching it come. Part 13. Where it goes. After Japan. Bavi's story does not end when it clears the Sakishima Islands, and that is a detail worth holding on to, because it reminds you that this is a storm on a journey through a densely populated corner of the world. After its closest approach to Japan on the night of July 10th into July 11th, the forecast track carries Bavi onward to the west and north, passing north of Taiwan and then continuing toward the coast of southeastern China. The projected landfall is near the eastern Chinese coast, in the vicinity of Shanghai, around July 12th, by which point the storm is expected to have weakened substantially into a tropical storm or a minimal typhoon. But even a weakened Bavi arriving near one of the largest urban regions on the planet is not a small event. The storm that struck Rota and menaced Japan still has one more act to play. Taiwan sits in an uneasy position in all of this, close enough to the forecast track to feel real effects, even if the centre passes to its north. The island has been bracing as Bavi approaches, and the expansive field of gale-force winds we discussed earlier, the one forecast to stretch across a broad area from Taiwan all the way to Okinawa, means that Taiwan does not need a direct hit to experience dangerous conditions. This is another consequence of Bavi's size. A large storm spreads its impacts across a wide swathe of geography, so that multiple islands and coastlines can be affected at once, each one feeling a different slice of the same enormous system. From the Yaeyama Islands of Japan to the northern reaches of Taiwan to the coast of China, a single storm is writing itself into the weather of an entire region over the span of just a few days. By the time Bavi reaches China, the terminal weakening we talked about should be well underway, the storm finally paying the price for running out of the thick warm water that sustained it. But the hazard shifts rather than disappears. A weakening tropical system moving over land often becomes less of a wind threat and more of a water threat, and that is a pattern this part of the world knows painfully well. We saw it just days ago, when a different, weaker storm stalled over southern China and turned into a catastrophic rainfall and flooding disaster, proving that the wind is not always the killer, that sometimes it is the water a dying storm wrings out over the land. Whether Bavi follows that same script near Shanghai will depend on how fast it moves and how much moisture it still carries when it comes ashore, and that is a story that will unfold in the days after Japan's ordeal. It helps, at this point, to place Bavi against the yardstick of history, so you understand where a storm like this fits in the grand scale of what the ocean can produce. The benchmark, the storm that sits at the very top of the record books, is Typhoon Tip, which in 1979 bottomed out at a central pressure of around 870 hectopascals, the lowest ever reliably measured, with a wind field so enormous it remains the largest tropical cyclone on record. Bavi, with its central pressure that dropped toward 910 millibars near its peak, is not going to break Tip's all-time record. But it does not need to break records to be historic in its impact. It belongs to the elite class of storms that flirt with the physical ceiling of what a typhoon can become, and its status as the most powerful storm on Earth this year, the third Category 5 of 2026, places it firmly in rare and dangerous company. This is not an ordinary storm having an ordinary season. This is one of the giants. The situation downstream deserves a closer look because it shows how a single storm can hold an entire region hostage across days. Taiwan, sitting just to the southwest of Bavi's forecast track, has been hunkering down as the storm approaches, and its position is genuinely uncomfortable. Even a track that carries the centre north of the island does not spare Taiwan from danger, because Bavi's wind field is so large that dangerous conditions extend far from the centre. This is the practical consequence of the broadening we discussed earlier. A storm that has spread out reaches more places at once, so that Taiwan and Japan can both be under threat from the same system on overlapping timelines, each bracing for its own slice of Bavi's enormous circulation. Then there is China, and the particular danger a weakening storm can pose to the mainland. When Bavi comes ashore near the eastern Chinese coast around July 12th, it should be a shadow of the Category 5 that struck Rota, downgraded to a tropical storm or a minimal typhoon by its long march over cooling water. But recent history in this very region is a warning against relaxing just because a storm has weakened. Only days ago, a different and weaker system stalled over southern China and unleashed a catastrophic rainfall and flooding disaster, a reminder that a dying storm can wring out enormous amounts of water over the land, and that the water, not the wind, is often what kills. Whether Bavi repeats that pattern near one of the most densely populated urban regions on Earth will depend on how fast it moves and how much moisture it carries inland, and it is a story that will play out after Japan has had its turn. What is unfolding across the region, then, is not a single landfall but a rolling event that will occupy the Western Pacific for the better part of a week. Japan braces first, in the hours immediately ahead. Taiwan braces alongside and just after, exposed by the sheer breadth of Bavi's wind field even without a direct hit. And China braces for the final act, watching a storm that will arrive weakened but still capable of unloading dangerous rain over an enormously populated coastline. Each of these places is preparing on its own timeline, according to its own exposure, but all of them are responding to the same single system, the same storm that struck Rota as a Category 5 and is now working its way methodically along its track. That is a remarkable amount of disruption for one storm to generate across so many shores. For the people of the Sakishima Islands, watching that regional picture offers no comfort, only context. It tells them that they are not facing some minor system that will trouble them alone and quickly pass, but a major regional event large and powerful enough to command the attention and preparation of multiple nations. It tells them that the storm bearing down on them tonight is the same storm the whole region is watching with concern, and it reinforces one more time why the word weakening deserves no relaxation of vigilance. Because a storm that can put Japan, Taiwan and China on alert across a single week is not a storm anyone in its immediate path can afford to take lightly. It also helps to hold Bavi against the ultimate benchmark, so its place in the order of things is clear. The most intense tropical cyclone ever reliably measured was Typhoon Tip back in 1979, which reached a central pressure of around 870 hectopascals and grew into the largest storm on record, its circulation spanning an enormous stretch of the Pacific. Bavi, bottoming out near 910 millibars at its peak, does not touch Tip's all-time record, and I want to be honest about that rather than inflate the comparison. but sitting in the same conversation as Tip, being mentioned in the context of the strongest storms ever recorded, is itself a mark of how formidable Bavi is. It is an elite storm, a giant among giants, and that is the thing now hours from Japan. And that is exactly why the people of the Sakishima Islands are not taking any comfort in the word weakening tonight. They understand that they are standing in front of one of the most powerful storms the planet has produced this year, a storm that has already proven what it can do to an inhabited island, a storm whose exact strength at the moment of closest approach is still uncertain, and a storm whose journey will carry it on to threaten Taiwan and China after it is finished with them. They are one stop on a long and destructive itinerary, but they are the next stop, and the storm is close now. So let us go back to those islands, and to the hours that are about to unfold, because the most important part of this entire story is not the record books or the downstream track, it is the night that is coming to Ishigaki. Part 14. The Night That Is Coming. Try to picture the hours ahead as the people on the Sakishima Islands must be picturing them tonight, because this is where all the numbers and forecasts and history finally become a lived experience. It begins with the wind on the morning of July 10th, that first steady 15 meters per second reaching across the islands, the physical confirmation that the waiting is over and the storm has arrived. Through the day, the wind climbs, the gusts building past 30 meters per second, the sky darkening, the rain thickening, the sea growing louder against the coast. This is the staircase we talked about, and every hour of July 10th is a step higher on it. By evening, the islands are being pushed toward the most dangerous stretch, the closest approach that comes in the dark hours between July 10th and July 11th. There is a specific quality to the peak hours of a major storm that anyone who has lived through one remembers, and it is worth trying to convey. The wind stops being a series of gusts and becomes a continuous, overwhelming presence, a sound that fills every space and does not relent, so loud and so constant that it becomes the whole world. The house or the shelter around you seems to breathe with it, doors straining, windows flexing, the structure itself alive with the pressure of the air. Time distorts. The hours of closest approach can feel endless, each minute stretched by the tension of not knowing whether the next gust will be the one that finds a weakness. This is the experience the Sakishima Islands are bracing for in the dark between July 10th and July 11th, and no forecast number can fully capture what it is like to be inside it. It is also, importantly, the time when the islands are most completely on their own. During the peak of the wind, no emergency vehicle can safely move, no responder can reach anyone in trouble, no outside help can do anything but wait for the storm to pass. Every household is essentially its own last line of defense, relying on the shelter it chose and the preparations it made. That reality is why the work done in advance matters so enormously, because the peak hours are not a time for action, but a time for endurance, for holding on and waiting out the worst. The preparation happens before, the surviving happens during, and only afterward, when the wind finally begins to ease, can anyone move again and begin to learn what the night has done. Those closest approach hours are the ones the entire forecast has been building toward, and they are the ones that will define whether Bavi is remembered here as a serious storm or a catastrophic one. This is when the sustained winds are forecast to reach 40 meters per second in some areas, when the instantaneous gusts could exceed 60, when the air itself becomes a force capable of destroying roofs and throwing debris and stripping away anything not firmly anchored. And it happens in darkness, which is its own particular cruelty, because a storm at night is a storm you can hear and feel but cannot see. A roar in the blackness punctuated by the crash of things breaking, with dawn and any real assessment of the damage still hours away. The people riding out those hours will be doing so in shelters and secured homes, listening to a storm they cannot watch, waiting for a morning that cannot come soon enough. Then, if the forecast holds, comes the water. After the closest approach, the rain is expected to intensify, potentially exceeding 50 millimeters an hour around the Sakishima Islands, a punishing rate that can overwhelm drainage and, on the steep terrain of these islands, set loose the slope failures that so often prove to be the deadliest legacy of a tropical system. So the ordeal does not end when the strongest winds pass. It shifts. The threat hands off from wind to water, and the danger continues in a different form, the way it so often does with these storms, the rain outlasting the gale and finding new ways to do harm. The night that is coming to Ishigaki is not a single blow, but a sequence of them. Wind giving way to more wind giving way to flooding rain, stacked across the dark hours and into the next day. And through all of it, the islands are alone. Remember that the airports are closed and the ferries are cancelled, that these exposed communities out at the southwestern tip of Japan have been cut off from the outside world for the duration of the storm's passage. There is no help arriving in the middle of that night. There is no evacuation off the island once the wind is up. There is only the shelter you're in, the plan you made, the supplies you gathered, and the storm outside. This is the reality that the calm language of a forecast can never quite capture. The profound aloneness of a small island in a large ocean with a very intense typhoon on top of it. The 3 days of methodical preparation, the shelter arrangements, the early cancellations, all of it was aimed at getting these communities ready to face exactly this, the hours when they would have only themselves and their preparations to rely on. Think about how a night like this actually unfolds for the people living through it, because the experience is not a single event but a long, escalating ordeal measured in hours. In the early evening the wind is already loud and the rain is already heavy, but the worst is still ahead, and there is a particular tension in knowing that. You have done everything you can. The shutters are up, the supplies are gathered, the family's in the safest room or in a shelter with neighbours, and now there is nothing left to do but listen as the storm builds toward its peak, hour after hour, each gust a little stronger than the last, the sound of the wind climbing from a roar to something that seems almost alive. That waiting, in the dark, with the storm still strengthening around you, is its own kind of endurance. Then comes the peak, the hours of closest approach between the night of July 10th and the early morning of July 11th, when the sustained winds reach their forecast 40 metres per second and the gusts hammer past 60. This is when things break. This is when the sounds change, when you hear debris slamming into walls, when the power may fail and the darkness becomes total, when the storm is no longer something happening outside but something pressing in on the very structure sheltering you. Emergency responders can do little during these hours because it is too dangerous to send anyone out into that wind. The island is, in the most literal sense, riding it out. Everyone is where they are going to be, and they simply have to hold until it passes. And then, if the forecast holds, the wind slowly begins to ease, but the ordeal shifts rather than ends, because the heavy rain moves in behind the storm and the threat becomes water rather than wind. Flooding, saturated slopes, the possibility of landslides on the steep island terrain, all of it stretching the danger into the following day. Only with the full light of morning can anyone really assess what happened in the dark, survey the damage, check on neighbours, begin to understand what the night took. That is the shape of the night that is coming to Ishigaki, a long arc from tents waiting through violent peak to a rain-soaked aftermath, and every family on those islands is bracing to live through the whole of it. The scale of the storm is impressive from orbit. From inside a house on Ishigaki, it is simply the longest night of the year. I keep returning to the people, because in the end this storm matters because of them. Bavi is a magnificent and terrible thing, a giant born of a warm ocean, a near-record monster crossing an entire sea, and it would be easy to get lost in the sheer spectacle of it. But the reason any of it matters, the reason we track it and forecast it and talk about it late into the night, is that at the end of its path are ordinary people in ordinary homes who are about to face something extraordinary and frightening. The family on Ishigaki checking their shutters one last time, the shelter filling with neighbours, the islands falling quiet as the wind begins to rise. That is the true weight of this story, and it is all converging now on a single night. Which brings us finally to the one question that has been sitting underneath everything, the question the islands cannot answer and cannot escape. Part 15. The countdown ends. Everything I have told you tonight comes down to a single unresolved question, and it is a cruel one, because it is a question the people in the storm's path cannot answer and cannot afford to guess wrong about. The question is this: will Bavi's forecast collapse arrive before it reaches the Sakishima Islands, sparing them the worst of its power, or will the storm hold its violent structure just long enough to rake Ishigaki and the Yaeyama Islands with its full fury, its 40-metre-per-second winds and its 60-metre-per-second gusts, before it finally breaks apart over the cooler water beyond? The entire fate of these islands hangs on the timing of a race between two invisible processes, the storm's weakening and the storm's arrival, and nobody yet knows which one wins. Everything about the next day comes down to a race that no one can watch directly, between two processes unfolding out over the water. On one side is Bavi's momentum, the storm still carrying enormous energy, still structured, still capable of delivering its forecast winds to the islands. On the other side is the cooling, thinning, warm layer ahead of it, the fuel supply beginning to fail, the terminal weakening that the forecast says should set in around 36 hours out. These two processes are running against each other with the Sakishima Islands as the finish line, and the outcome, whether Bavi arrives still fierce or meaningfully diminished, depends entirely on which one gets there first. It is a race being run in slow motion, over hundreds of kilometres of ocean, with the lives and homes of an island community riding on the result. What makes it so difficult to bear is that the race cannot be called in advance with any confidence. The margin of uncertainty in the measurements, the difficulty of knowing exactly how much warm water lies along the final approach, the inherent unpredictability of how fast a storm structure will respond, all of it means that reasonable forecasts still span a range of outcomes. The islands are left in the hardest possible position, knowing that the answer exists, that it is being determined right now, and that they will not learn it until it is upon them. So they prepare for the worse outcome and hope for the better, which is the only rational thing to do when the race is this close and the stakes are this high. This is the terrible mathematics of Bavi. We know it is weakening. We know why. The warm ocean fuel failing along its final approach, the eye wall reorganizing, the terminal decline forecast to set in around 36 hours out. But knowing that it is weakening tells us nothing about whether it will weaken in time. If the collapse comes early, the Sakishima Islands might face a storm that is serious but survivable, dangerous but diminished. If the collapse comes late, they face the near full force of one of the most powerful storms on the planet this year. And the uncertainty in the measurements, the fact that no aircraft has flown into Bavi to pin down exactly how strong it is, means that even the experts are working with error bars around the very numbers that would tell us which way the race is going to break. The islands are being asked to prepare for the worst version while hoping for the best, because the honest truth is that the answer will not be known until it is already happening. And that, in the end, is why the people of the Sakishima Islands cannot wait for certainty. They cannot afford to bet on the optimistic version of the forecast, cannot afford to relax because a headline used the word weakening, cannot afford to assume the storm will fall apart before it reaches them. They have to prepare tonight for the full ferocity of a storm that struck a United States Commonwealth as a Category 5 just days ago, because that same storm is now hours from their own coasts, and its exact strength at arrival is genuinely unknown. So they have shut down the airports and the ferries. They have closed the beaches and readied the shelters. They have done everything that experience and wisdom and generations of living on a dangerous edge have taught them to do. And now they wait, in the last hours before the wind rises, for a storm whose true nature will only reveal itself once it is already screaming across the islands in the dark. Let me leave you with the full weight of the uncertainty, because it is the truest thing about this entire situation. Right now, as these islands make their final preparations, there exists no one, no forecaster, no supercomputer, no expert anywhere on Earth who can tell the people of Ishigaki with certainty how hard Bavi will hit them. The models can offer ranges, the satellites can offer estimates, the forecasters can offer their best and most experienced judgment. But the actual answer, the real intensity of the storm at the moment it reaches the islands, is being decided right now out over the ocean, in the invisible race between the storm's hunger for warm water and the cooling sea that is starting to starve it. And that answer will only become knowable at the exact moment it stops mattering as a forecast and starts mattering as a reality, when the wind is already on the islands. That is the strange and humbling position we are all in tonight, watching a storm we cannot control close in on people we cannot help from here, knowing that the thing that will determine their fate is still unresolved even as the hours run out. There is a version of Bavi that weakens in time and gives the Sakishima Islands a hard but survivable night. There is a version that holds its violence just long enough to arrive near full strength. Both versions are still possible as I speak, and the islands have to prepare for the worse one while praying for the better. There is no bravado in that, no drama, just the quiet, serious work of a community getting ready to face something it cannot predict and cannot avoid. So we watch and we wait along with them. We watch the storm that crossed an entire ocean, that struck one nation as a Category 5 and is about to test itself against another, that carries a power almost beyond comprehension and a future almost impossible to pin down. And somewhere out there in the dark tonight, On a scattering of small islands at the far southwestern edge of Japan, the lights are on in the shelters and the families are together, and the wind is beginning to rise. They have done everything right. They have prepared as well as anyone can prepare. And now, like us, they can only wait to meet the storm and learn, in the hardest way there is, exactly what kind of monster made that long journey across the sea to find them. There is something humbling in that image, and it is worth sitting with as we close. For all our satellites and our models and our forecasts, for all the precision of our numbers and the sophistication of our science, we are still, in the most fundamental sense, watchers. We can see the storm coming. We can measure it, estimate it, track it, warn about it. But we cannot call it off, cannot steer it away, cannot know for certain what it will do until it does it. The people of the Sakishima Islands tonight are living inside that humbling truth, standing on their exposed frontier of land, watching the most powerful storm of the year close the distance, doing the only thing that can be done, which is to prepare and to wait. Bavi has crossed an entire ocean to reach them. It has struck one nation and is about to strike another. And in the hours between the night of July 10th and the morning of July 11th, on a scattering of small Japanese islands out at the edge of the map, we are all about to learn together exactly what kind of storm made that journey. The countdown is almost over, and the only thing left to do now is watch the sky and hope that the islands out there in the dark are ready for whatever comes down out of it.